In today's video, we're going to look at the difference between state, local, and federal in terms of where you should start as a small business. The criteria I'm going to use to judge is based on small business goals, small business qualifications, teaming, some of the rules and working with each one of these three groups, source selection, meaning how do they actually choose contractors, work role in terms of your business and organization, the experience of the contracting officers or the people that you're meeting with, and then growth potential. So let's get started today looking at local, state, and federal in terms of small business goals. Right? At the local level, they vary. So a lot of times you'll have CBE or CSBE is what we used to formerly call it. And then sometimes if you're near airports, they'll have some of the goals associated with being in proximity of an airport, proximity of the location. So they do have lots of goals around local contracting. Now, at the state level, they use what's called DBE, right? Disadvantaged Business Enterprise, which has about 10% goals for doing business with small businesses. On the local level, those goals range 15% up to in the 20s, right? As high as I've seen it. But people typically will stack on goals, meaning that I've seen organizations have a CBE, which is a business goal for the local area, but then also have a community goal and then also have a proximity goal in terms of close within 5 miles or 10 miles of the area. Great for those of you who have very strong local organizations and local communities, local municipalities who actually want to do right by small businesses. Not so good when they don't want to do right and the goals are just, for example, fluff, to say the least. And I'll give you some examples of that, like in Miami-Dade County. They've got these goals for small businesses. However, when you go and ask them how are they doing in terms of meeting those goals, right? You go and look under the hood, you'll see that the actual percentage of minorities, let's say Black minorities in particular, in Miami-Dade County achieving those goals is somewhere in the neighborhood of less than 1%. So again, they like to talk about having the goals, but if you look closer underneath the hood, are they actually fulfilling the goals? That's another subject. Same thing at DBE under the 10% mark. So when you look at DBE at the 10% mark, no state has ever hit the 10% goal. And that's astonishing to me, given that they've had these things for the better part of several decades now. But again, digging under the hood, you will see that no state has ever hit their 10% goals. A lot of times, what I see with all of these things is the ideal of them is better than actually the execution of them. And so again, I just say caution everyone to dig under the hood. And then on the federal level, 23% goes small businesses. They have their scorecards that are publicly available that anyone could take a look at. And many of the government agencies and entities boast and brag about being successful at hitting these goals, and not only just hitting them, exceeding them. So the first criteria I like to look at is how are they doing in terms of their goals? The second criteria is small business qualifications, meaning how do you qualify or what determines you to be a small business? At the local level, the threshold's usually around $5 million, meaning that if your revenues are below $5 million, you qualify, you're eligible as small businesses, which is great. I mean, that puts 99% of us in that category. So good thing to know. Same thing at the state levels, right? On a DBE, the thresholds are in the single digit millions. So again, this is good because most of us qualify. The challenge then becomes what happens when you want to grow on a growth path, right? So what happens when you want to exceed that or be in hyper growth mode? You now are competing with the big companies out there, right? So if you look at it from a standpoint of, yes, 99% of us fall underneath that, but what about those outliers? What about the 15% of us who want to go above $5 million, right? That doesn't allow for that potential. You cap out at that mark. Now, in theory, you don't cap out because you get to qualify and compete in the bigger pools. And we could talk about that later on in the video. But in theory, if you're going to be spending your time and efforts in something, personally, I believe we should be looking here at the federal, where as a small business, you can go up to 10,000 employees, or if you were to pick, as I say, construction or something, 45 million in revenue. So now let's look at something that it's funny because I remember Will Smith gave this example when he was deciding upon which movie roles to take. He looked at which movie roles had the biggest opportunities. And so he decided, okay, if I'm going to spend all my time and effort pursuing something, a career, which ones had the biggest opportunities? And he realized that A alien movies or movies associated with aliens and sci-fi had the biggest blockbuster hits. And so he chose that path. So again, if you given this information, right, just as in these first 2 line items, if you look at which one has the biggest upside potential to grow into, still remaining small business, meaning you still qualify with people that are in your same area, right? Same type of size. This one is, for me personally, is why I like the federal. Teams. What does that mean by teams? Meaning that most of us, when we start off, we're solopreneurs, entrepreneurs, we're less than 5-person companies, entities, or maybe we're a former 1099er, right? And so part of the strategy to growing bigger that the larger companies use is one of 2 things. They do acquisitions or they team with other organizations. Unfortunately, at the lower level, right, what they do is they make you sign what's called a collusion affidavit. And again, if you don't know what this is, here's one example on the screen. When we're bidding projects with other small businesses, we sign collusion affidavits. Same thing at the state level. We sign what's called a collusion affidavit. So what a collusion affidavit says is that you cannot work with another company collectively to go after this project or to collude, and so to speak, to set the price of the project or say, hey, we're going to work together. And we're going to both say, okay, you're going to bid 10,000, I'm going to bid 12,000, right? That's called colluding. At the federal level, they encourage what we call cooperation, or better known as teaming. In fact, there's agreements out there called teaming agreements. And when you look inside of the RFPs and RFQs at the federal level, you'll see that they talk about teaming and teaming agreements, right? Because they encourage cooperation. They're looking for the best team to go after this project, meaning that you and your buddy can get together and say, hey, you're going to do this piece, I'm going to do this piece, and let's bid this project together. Or, and it chances of sources sought, RFIs, when the government's doing market research, trying to find small businesses, we actually call it competitive mates, meaning that we both are going to submit and say that we can perform this work so that the government can make it a small business set aside. So it's just the fundamental thinking is different for me personally at the state and local levels versus the federal level. Let's get into some of the rules. So the rules, how you do business at the local level, it varies from municipality to municipality. Take, for example, where I come from, which is Miami-Dade County. Miami-Dade County has 30 plus something municipalities. Broward County has 30 something plus municipalities. What does that mean? You've got Pembroke Pines, you've got Hollywood, you've got Miramar, you've got Hialeah, you've got Cutler Bay and South Bay, and Homestead. You've got all these different areas that have different sets of rules. So when you work with them, you have to follow by their rules. Even within Miami-Dade County, you've got the city of Miami has its own rules. They don't even have any type of small business program that is regulated, so to speak. They have their own internal program. But then if you go to Miami-Dade County, they've got another set of rules, and they've got the 7340 program, a 7360 program, right? So you've got to learn a lot of different rules. Same thing at the state level, right? If you were working in Florida versus working in Georgia versus working in North Carolina, again, each state has their own set of rules. One clear example that I like to give is some states have veteran business programs, right? Whereas other states don't have veteran business programs. Some cities have programs for veterans, others don't have it. So all in all, it's not a bad thing because if you are hyper-focused on that local area and you study it, you can master it. But for those of us, again, the top 15% of us who want to grow and scale beyond that size, it makes it really challenging to try and learn each set of rules with each particular group, organization, municipality. With the federal government, they have 2 sets of rules primarily for 99% of all agencies and offices. That's FAR and DFARS. So you learn FAR, you learn DFARS. It doesn't matter what state, city you're operating in. If it's on a federal facility, those are the only set of rules you have to go by, which makes it really easy when you are doing things like making changes to the contract or you're having to understand what they're looking for in terms of the documents and the forms that you fill out. It makes it really easy and less confusing to have one set of rules, and then once you master that, then essentially you are in control of your own destiny. Source selection, meaning how do they choose contractors? From my experiences, I've seen at the local levels that they're always choosing the low bid. Now, again, there are some advantages that what we can do to help make you more successful or give you a higher probability of winning. Like one of the things that I love at the local level is that they have walkthroughs. So if you don't go to the walkthrough, then you don't qualify for the bid. So that increases your probability. If you are to go to walkthroughs and you see that there's not that many people there, then there's a higher probability that whenever you submit, you're competing against the 3 or 4 people that are there. So you've got a 1 in 25% chance. You've got a 33% chance of winning. So though that's good in that essence. However, the low bid situation doesn't allow you to build a super highly profitable company. And again, because every single city's rule is different, some cities where I've seen, like for example, Miami-Dade County, we had special programs where we had rotation lists. And so you would put your name on a rotation list, and then they would choose companies based on that rotation list. And so those are some favorable things that certain cities I've seen do. Again, if you've got a city that has a strong municipal government that's actively wanting to encourage small businesses, this is a great way to go. But if you find that you've got a city that is really lax in the rules and they don't really care about enforcement of these different programs, then that presents a challenge. At the state level, again, another low bid situation. And I see there's a lot of politics involved in state contracts as well. So I've seen where they awarded contracts to people or companies that were not low bid, but in those instances, it was politically motivated. So a lot of people that I know that do really well at the state levels, they've got a lot of key connections with Congress people and House of Representatives people and political folks, which again, for me, that's a different game that I'm not accustomed to playing. And also, it's not something that I believe you can teach a lot of people, right? We can't really teach smoozing up to politicians. So, and my experience is what I've seen at the federal level, it's a more level playing field. I'm not saying that at the highest levels, they're not doing some of these things, but most of us are competing in contracts in the single digit millions or less. And so at those levels, there's a lot of fairness and equity being distributed, a lot of meritocracy. So LPTA, lowest price technically acceptable. Yes, it's low bid. However, you have to first write a technically acceptable proposal, which allows you to create some sort of separation from the guy in the back of a pickup truck or the person who doesn't know how to write or the person who simply is too lazy to organize their thoughts and ideas about how they're going to accomplish this project. So it allows us to create some sort of separation and to make us at least say, hey, we can articulate how we're going to get this accomplished, which allows us to be one step above the guy who's just saying, hey, I've got the cheapest price, not saying how he's going to actually get this accomplished. Best value, which means they don't even go with the cheapest price. So I've seen instances where the government did not choose the cheapest price. They chose the best value for them. And I've had students of mine who were literally the lowest bidder not get awarded the contract. Many times because the government thought, hey, you're too cheap and you're not going to be able to deliver. So they went with what they call best value. And then they do what's called sole source or negotiated contracts, which is where I like to play in that arena. So when you look at sole source and negotiated work, you don't actually have to have a certification to do any of this type of stuff. What do you mean, Eric? Easy. When you look at simplified acquisition, SAP and micro purchases, all that is by law, right, goes to small businesses. And depending upon the threshold, they can literally just use a credit card purchase to buy items from you, which we have students doing all the time. They can send only you email with the write-up, and so that you're the only one responding. Again, another form of that. They can publicly post it on a building within a base, which means that no one else gets to see it. Again, there's a lot of flexibility in here once you have developed relationships with these particular decision makers and depending on the size of the project, where they can actually award you direct contracts or negotiate with only your firm and not have to compete in the open market. So a lot of that is happening all over the place. If you are curious as to what that looks like, here on the screen, just Google it, simplified acquisition, micro purchases, spending over the last 3 or 4 years, and you'll see the numbers are staggering. They're in the billions of dollars. Work role. That means that what type of entrepreneurs typically are doing these contracts. So what I've seen at the local level, smaller folks doing these type of contracts, not growing businesses that are, like I said, less than 10 employees, more worker type manager roles. So a lot of the people that want to perform with your hands and you want to fulfill the contract, like if you're a beautician or you pressure wash cars, I've just seen that a lot of times it's for people who want to get their hands dirty. So if you are an engineer or you're an architect, or you're the practitioner, this is typically good for you because they like those types of businesses servicing them. Meaning that, like, if I'm in construction, I have to have a construction license to do this role. That makes me, the person, Eric Coffie, liable or responsible for getting this accomplished. Same thing at the state level. They really want you to focus on your employees, your W-2 people executing on that work. So you've got to hire people, put them on your team, and get them to perform the work, which could be advantageous if that's the type of business that you have set up. But for me personally, when I look at the federal government, it's more of an ownership role. So less of worker manager, more owner, meaning that you can assemble a team of people below you to get it accomplished. So I say construction manager because we are essentially managing and overseeing the projects, not necessarily performing or executing them. Now, with that said, for those smart people who are saying, well, what about subcontracting? Yes, there are rules of subcontracting. And so depending upon the type of program, if it's 50%, 75%, 80% subcontracting rules, which we've got other videos on that, but it allows you to set up systems where you can bring people onto your payroll for the purpose of accomplishing that project and executing it from within the team members that you've assembled. So you can go out, find other companies, essentially do an arbitrage play where they fulfill the work. And this is totally acceptable because at the federal level, they want you managing the work, not actually performing and executing it. They actually reward you for being liable and responsible and overseeing it and managing it, not necessarily for you digging the shovel with your own two hands. And it also allows for a PE model. So when you look at a PE model, you've got the entity at the top, you've got a holding company, and you've got all these sub entities below it. So it allows for these types of structures for us who are more creative, who may have access to capital or resources, or who may want to scale to tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. So the federal allows entities to do this structure successfully within the confines of their rules. Contracting officer experience. So at the local level, I've seen it to be very inconsistent. You get people that were moved from this office or that office and stuck into a role to work contracts or to write proposals. In fact, when I was short on resources, I took a job with the county for a little bit of time, about 6-7 months, and they had me writing contracts. Now, I had experience of actually performing contracts, but I wasn't trained in how to write contracts. I just used my knowledge and experience from performing and executing them to actually write them. However, I didn't actually have experience writing the contract. So what does that mean? So I was doing the best that I could, but not formally based on any sets of rules or parameters. Now, that could be good and bad depending upon who you are. It could be good if you are saying, hey, look, this guy don't know what he's doing. I could take advantage of this guy. Cool, right? So that could be the case with a local agency. So you may have favor because the person doesn't know what they're doing. You think you could take advantage of them. Cool. What I found is that it makes it challenging because when I won a project with the city of Florida City, and it was years ago, because someone challenged the project, even though we had all of the compliance needed. So they challenged our project, but we were compliant because we had the certification to actually perform the work. But because somebody challenged it based on our name, local government just threw it out, so they didn't want to fight. So rather than saying, hey, look, this people check all the boxes, they have the appropriate licenses to perform this work, they just threw out the bid. Well, that didn't help me because the multi-million-dollar bid was one of our first ones, and the government just threw it out because the person who was in charge of the contract was like, I don't want to deal with this, so they just threw it away. At the state level, I see that they do have better trained people making the decisions. However, again, I find that at the state level, it's a very bureaucratic in terms of a lot of politics. So I find that it to be more challenging. Even though people know what they're doing, they also know how to skirt the rules and make it in favor of people or companies that they're connected to politically. So I just find it to be a much more challenging process to work with. And then at the federal level, what's interesting about that is that everyone there are trained and certified. So the contracting officers actually have warrants, which means they have to go through school and education and actually pass tests to be able to actually issue contracts or what they call obligate the government to fund. And so because they're certified, because they're trained, they understand the rules. Now, again, you're going to find exceptions to anything in life, right? But for the most part, they understand the rules, they understand how to navigate the rules, and they're more apt to suggestions. If you say, hey, look up the rules in the FAR of how to do this thing, I find them to be more open to that and then saying, yes, you're right, Eric. I see here in the rule book what it says and how to do it. And so because they are liable potentially for the contract, they're more likely to say, okay, what does the rule say and how it's spelled out, and then follow that strictly by the book. I like that because I like to know what I'm getting into. So whenever I play a game, I want to know the rules of the game. So I know the rules of engagement. So I don't like to where people are changing the rules on me constantly, moving the ball, because it doesn't allow me to actually be consistent and growing a successful business. And then the last thing, growth potential. So on the local level, for me, right, if we go back to the qualifications, right, your growth potential is maxed out up to whatever that local level is, $5 million. Now, technically it's not, because after $5 million, you can compete with open market bids, which is okay. But in terms of your small business growth potential, you're really maxed out at $5 million. So once you get to about $5 million revenue, which there's nothing wrong with that. So if that is your aspiration to do that, or if you feel like, look, Eric, I can have a successful life, a successful business at $2 million a year, then that's great. All I'm doing is stating the fact. Same thing with the DBE. Whatever your state DBE's thresholds are, typically same thing in a low digit millions. That's where you're essentially maxed out before you have to go to open market. At the federal level, I say unlimited growth potential because one, 10,000 employees, $45 million. Once you get to that type of numbers, then you really have a business that can do a lot of different things, right? So you've got a business that's doing upwards of 10, 15, $20 million, then it makes it really easy for you to go out and do commercial contracts and to expand into other areas because you have capacity now, you've got capabilities, you've got cash flow, right? You've got a lot of infrastructure in place that allows your business to go out and do a lot of other things. So here is all of the things that I've learned over my experiences of working the different types of contracts. Let's get to some frequently asked questions that people may have for me. So one of the questions that people always ask is, Eric, will state or local, if I start there, will that prepare me for federal? And my answer is no, it doesn't. I've not seen a person successfully go from local or state up into federal. I've seen a lot of people try it, and it's been extremely challenging. In fact, they come to me and go, Eric, I thought I'm doing really well at the local level, or I'm doing decent at the state level. I'm trying to do this federal thing, and it's totally different. And that's true because the process is different. A lot of times, the people who I've seen who've done really well at the local levels, because they've taken advantage of certification programs. And so they thought that, hey, I'll give you an example of a friend of mine. I'm a big time contractor in New York. New York has a very strong, because again, New York is a liberal state. They have a very strong local business program that essentially does a lot of the things that a lot of the other ones claim to do. And so if you were just showed up and you had a business and you could do work, again, if they put you on a rotation list and give you contracts because you can actually do something, then you build your business that way, but you didn't effectively have to compete in the open market. So you go in and you say, okay, well, I'm doing decent there. I want to transition that over to federal. Well, there's 50 of you at the federal level, right? And so now no one cares that you have this 10-person engineering firm and that you guys can engineer in New York. That doesn't translate into other places. So I've found that people rarely go local, state to federal. However, with that said, I found a lot of people are very, very, very successful going federal, state, local. So I've found it to be the opposite. So once you understand the federal rules and how to play the federal game, because for a lot of people it seems to be the most challenging to them, then you could go back down to state and local, because now you can take advantage of some of the other programs that are favorable towards minorities or people with disadvantages. So I found that if you can go federal, state, local, but I've seen it be harder going local, state, federal. Which one do I start with no experience? So for me personally, it just depends on the type of business, really. So for example, John Bowen, one of our students that started a long time ago, he didn't have any experience. He started at the local level. But again, John was a guy who worked with his hands. So he was trying to sell batteries, which is great. But then he didn't mind getting into pest control or COVID cleaning, where he actually hired guys to go out and clean the buildings. And so for him, that worked out very favorable and he grew his business that way. And so he started with no experience. But then I have other students who, like again, if we look on my channel, who started off at the federal level doing, for example, DLA or Unison Marketplace, where you could just bid to resell products at that level. They learned the DIB system. We've had people learn the Unison system, and they've been able to do that. And then we have people like Maria who learn how to become arbitrage, right? So arbitrage is where you will find someone who has the ability to execute, and then you go find opportunity and put those two together. I've had more people doing the federal successfully without any experience than I've had doing the local contract successfully without experience. Just to bring up to speed, John today is a very successful local contractor. However, he has not successfully crossed over to the federal arena yet. Whereas Maria, who, again, going back, she did arbitrage play, has done federal and state and local contracts successfully. So she's been able to do all three starting off at federal. Does it help if I'm certified? Yeah, absolutely. It does help if you're certified. But again, it just really depends on the strength of the people administering the certification program. So what I'm saying by that is I have people that are working in different cities. I made a video that talked about if you are the majority in your city. So what we want to do, right? This is the plan that I have for everybody here. We want to target areas, cities, municipalities with predominantly Black and brown people in leadership. Why is this important? It's important because we're looking for an advocate. We're looking for people that are pushing to get more participation amongst the underserved communities. So wherever you are, you want to find that place. The easiest way that I found is to simply look at cities where there's a majority of us living. And so when I went back and I looked at these cities here, right, these were the cities that I found. By the way, Inglewood is on the list in California. So look, Ricardo says, in Ohio, you don't need a license for state or federal. EP, listen, the reason why you're here today is to learn differently, right? I know what your previous experiences taught you. That's why we're here. EP, do me a favor. If you do exactly this, I want to hear your story when it turns out. Okay. Yvette, thank you for telling the people. For federal contracts, you don't need a license to do construction. All right, now check this out. We want to focus on areas, right, where they are a lot of Black and brown people. They ain't never met their goals. Someone says New York. New York is amazing. New York has some of the best diversity programs in the country. Somebody mentioned New York up here. I saw New York on my list. I saw a bunch of cities in New York. I saw, let's see, what was in New York? Now, again, I'm not saying you can only do here. I'm not saying only. There's no only. Remember this. No state or city has ever met their goals. I'm just trying to get us more favorable odds. For example, let's say Miami. Miami's majority Hispanic population, right? So if you're in one of those two categories, it might be very helpful to have the certification because that is the majority of the decision makers that are awarding contracts, right? So you're going to see a lot of favoritism. But if you are in a place like, let's say, Cape Coral, or if you're up on that West Coast where you have different leadership who's not enforcing these things, it might be more challenging for you. I've personally lived in a red state my whole time. So because of that, I have not been able to have a lot of people who I know break through successfully without engaging with politicians. And what instances do I choose local? So going back to, again, if the political climate favors these types of programs, then I think it's great for you, depending upon where you live. And by the way, I've had, and one of my clients, he said this to me a long time ago, he moved to the state of Rhode Island because as a Black contractor, he could not break through in some of the other states. So he moved to Rhode Island, which essentially allowed him to, again, use his skills and qualifications, but also really enforce the rules for all of these different types of programs. So again, it really is depending upon where you live and who you are, like what you look like effectively, whether or not the programs locally are going to do an impact on you. Fortunately, when you look at the federal column, none of that matters. And then what instance should I choose federal? Well, for me, you should choose federal when you have big goals, you want to put together teams, and also you would like to not be confined to your local area, meaning that the type of business that you have can be a national business, or because the business doesn't have to be region located, you got the opportunities to grow across the United States. So those are instances where I would choose federal. There's a lot of information here. Go back, watch the video again, and I'm going to put up on the screen an example of one of our successful students who's done federal contracting here that you can watch. But if you found this to be helpful, subscribe to our channel, like and share this, and then add a comment. Tell me which one that you like the best and where you think you want to start at.